Well, thank you, John. This is a very brief introduction. I'm very happy that you're here again.
Does the microphone work?
Yes.
It does? Okay, so great.
No light. No light. But it's better no light in the mind than no hot water in it.
Absolutely. I'll tell you about that later. So don't stand too close to me, as Sting famously sang. I promise to put musical references. If you know the Police song, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, go listen to it. Don't stand so close to me. The Police. Thanks very much, Luis. It's always a great pleasure to be back here in Mação. I've been able, thanks to Luis, to come basically once a year for the past 6 years or so, except during the pandemic period. And even when I haven't been able to come here in person, I've often been connected by Zoom, and it's always a great pleasure to do so. And I don't know if anyone has said this at other of the meeting, but I'd like to dedicate this talk to someone who recently passed away. And we discussed with Luis whether we should do something formally. Maybe we can. Maybe we can simply sing it on Thursday night, since Fernando has promised to provide musical instruments for an impromptu performance of something. We don't know what yet, because it's impromptu. So I'd like to dedicate this talk to the memory of Adama Sanaseku, former president of the International Council for Philosophy and Human Sciences, among many other functions, and someone with whom I worked very, very closely for many years, from about 2009 when we first met, until the pandemic, which broke off relations, sadly, though we were still in touch by message, and with whom in particular, along with Luis and a few other people of the core team, we delivered one of the most unlikely events ever to be organized by humans, given the circumstances of its organization and the ambition and its remarkable success, which was the World Humanities Conference held in Liège, Belgium, in August 2017, which had been Adama's big from 2009 onwards, and which somehow we managed to deliver, in spite of UNESCO. Much more than thanks to UNESCO, and in spite of many other things that got in the way of effective organization. And indeed, it was quite amusing yesterday in ITM to see the Principal World Humanities Conference being put to good use, an excellent example of impact. I took a photograph which I forgot to put on social media, I will, to prop up the video projector, which is perhaps very telling, and actually a nice story, that it's evidence of the fact that science, engineering, and technology, the STEM disciplines, can't actually function without the underpinning of the humanities. Maybe. Did anyone notice that what was propping up the projector was the proceedings of the Humanities Conference? Nice message. So, Adama, ride into the sunset, and we think of you. This talk is a continuation of a talk I gave last year, not at the Apheleia seminar, but at the opening of the PhD program, connecting by Zoom, and which was published by Luis in a brochure, along with the other same occasion. Some of you might have seen it. If you haven't, of course, I encourage you to read it. It was about George Orwell, and how Orwell might help us think about sustainability. And core of that presentation, if you've read 1984, you know why, was some reflections about Orwell's thinking about the past, about memory, and about artifacts and their meanings. If you've read 1984, you know that material objects play a very important role in Orwell's construction of the idea that preserving the past as objective fact is an essential barrier against the threats of totalitarianism. Since totalitarianism, satirized in the novel in the form of the English Socialist Party, ideology INSOC, is engaged in a constant process of revising the past to make it coterminous with the present. Everything party must always be right, and since circumstances mean the party was never always literally right, or wasn't always literally right, the past has to be rewritten to ensure that present and past are seamlessly connected. And I'm sure everyone is familiar with the novel. And certain objects, in particular a paperweight and a notebook, play a very important role in creating a continued past and present, which isn't simply identity, and which is based not on the past being rewritten to match the present, but on the past existing in the present in ways that introduce a visible seam between past and present, a space of uncertainty, a space of discussion, a space of interpretation, which is precisely what the party wishes to deny. The title of my talk today is along the same lines, and I'd like to offer you some reflections about past, present and future from the perspective of museums, not because I'm a specialist on museums, but because I have ideas about museums that you might find interesting, and building on the Neb's Art project, which Nuno presented yesterday, which was also an occasion for me to start thinking about museums along these lines, using also some competences which we have in my business activities around this issue, since one of my business associates is actually a specialist in this area. So, in talking about Orwell, the past, present, and I also talked about the future, but Orwell had very little to say about the future, actually. So those were the concluding remarks on my own account, based on Orwell's discussions of past and future. The center of that piece was artifacts, how they circulate, what they mean, and in particular the muteness of the uncurated past. In the world of the party, capital P, the past cannot be mute. It must be in ideological conformity with the present. But the objects that circulate outside the party's control, if they do, that's a whole other story as to whether they really do circulate outside the party's control. I discussed that in the previously mentioned paper, is that they are mute, or at least speak ambiguously. No one knows where the paperweight comes from, certainly not Winston Smith, the protagonist. No one knows who previously owned it, how it came to be in the antique shop where he found it. He's not even sure what uses it had in the past, because the very concept of the paperweight has essentially disappeared in a society where the durability of paper is itself a threat to the party's agenda. The paperweight circulates as something that has beauty and that has a kind of inscrutability, an ineffable purpose, which is what makes it fascinating to someone living in that ideological world, but also indicates the kind of relation between past and present that Orwell is trying to present. Not as a technical disquisition on museums and memory and conservation and so on, as a political tract, but nonetheless, it is, at least reading between the lines, a disquisition on what it is to relate to the past and to preserve it through artifacts. If artifacts are not mute, they can't be interpreted. Or more precisely, if there isn't a space of inscrutability, they cannot be open to interpretation. If they're not open to interpretation, they can't be inserted into a story which is a present story. And if the artifacts cannot be narrated, then it's very difficult to museify. To say the past is mute is thus not exactly to say that it doesn't speak. It is to say that when it does so, it is, at least potentially, not necessarily, by a form of ventriloquism, which is how the past usually speaks. Someone in the present gives past objects of various kinds, including texts, which, while they're not literally mute, they provide their own discourse about what they're saying, are nonetheless open to interpretation, because what they were saying in the context in which they were saying it is not immediately apparent. And I don't know if you paid attention to the funerary monuments in the Branch Museum, which Luis took us round the day before yesterday. For those of you who were on that visit, it's very interesting to see what it means to decipher epigraphic inscriptions. It's not just a matter of reading. First, because not everything is legible. So there is guesswork and interpretation involved in identifying which letter corresponds to a barely readable physical trace. Secondly, because it's all in shorthand, and knowledge of the shorthand cannot come from the stone itself. It has to come from a body of knowledge that enables the stone to speak, which is what I'm calling ventriloquism for the purpose of this discussion. That shorthand, even if we consider that specialists in Roman history have very effectively deciphered it, and the fact that there's so much epigraphic information certainly helps, it is nonetheless an interpretive framework that could in principle be open to challenge. When we read, may the earth be light on you, which is very consistent with my epigraphic dedication of this presentation, we're actually reading three letters which we're interpreting as shorthand for that particular wish, that particular dedication of the monument to a particular person. Maybe we've got it completely wrong. Maybe those letters meant something different. Maybe they have multiple meanings, sometimes meaning that and sometimes meaning something completely different. That inscrutability, at least in part, is the whole point of interpretation. But interpretation as ventriloquism raises some important questions. Which ventriloquist? Which dummy? And how can the performance be justified, including in terms of fakeness versus authenticity, which we started discussing yesterday with respect to musical performance. In a true ventriloquist performance, I'm sure you've seen this, they're remarkably technically competent and funny sometimes, the dummy supposedly speaks and says things that the performer couldn't say, including outrageous things. And in fact, ventriloquism has often been a way of putting political commentary at one remove to allow someone to say something without exactly saying it. That's ventriloquism. Putting the speech apart from the speaker in ways that create a kind of double frame of reference. I didn't say it, my dummy did. And as perhaps you know, there have been scandals around ventriloquism in several countries. I know the UK and France, I'm sure the same is true in other countries, where ventriloquists have been criticized and severely attacked for things that dummies have said, which were politically incorrect, insulting, sexist, racist, or whatever. And of course, the answer is, I didn't say it, the dummy said it. And in a sense, this is true because it's the point of the whole performance. At another level, it's obviously false because the dummy doesn't literally speak. This is the kind of relationship we typically entertain to the past, and it resonates with the discussion we were having informally about cover bands. And again, I promised to work in musical references, but this one is actually very apposite. I think I mentioned Australian Pink Floyd in session and not simply à table. Australian Pink Floyd is a band made up of Australian musicians of very high competence who play Pink Floyd's music. They're not Pink Floyd. The performance is a cover, explicitly. In what sense are they performing Pink Floyd? Or are they performing the music of Pink Floyd? Or a version of the music of Pink Floyd? What exactly is the status of the connection? And of course, Pink Floyd still exists, though rarely performing these days, and also plays its own music, and very largely in the same way, except less technically competent, because they got very old. Roger Waters can no longer sing. But his shows are interesting because he doesn't just perform Pink Floyd. He gives a Roger Waters show. I'm not talking about politics here, just talking about music, whatever you think of his politics. He basically can no longer sing, but there's something much more authentic about Roger Waters performing a Roger Waters concert than Pink Floyd performing Dark Side of the Moon. But what makes it more authentic? The fact that it's not as good. Just think about it. Where does authenticity, where do authenticity and fakeness come in here? And what's the relation between the ventriloquist and the dummy? Because you get where I'm going here, which is that if we look at the functions of a museum, then the ventriloquism is actually quite explicit in the functions, even though it's not recognized as ventriloquism. It is an almost unthinking relation to the past that is built into how the institutions and practices we call museums have developed since the 19th century. And they're a fairly recent invention. This is well documented. Antiquity didn't really have museums, nor did the Middle Ages. And in the classical period, gentlemen's cabinets of curiosities, as they were often called, or the monster rooms that educated gentlemen like to have with weird things in formaldehyde to gaze upon and reflect on, were precursors of what ultimately became a museum, but obviously filtered through different expectations and codes. For 6 years, from 2017 to 2023, I was chair of the Ethics Advisory Committee of the French Natural History Museum. So I'm building on that experience in making some comments, but the French Natural History Museum isn't specific in this regard. Its conception of its functions, its strategic plan and presentation of itself to its audiences and to its public sponsors is, I think, pretty standard in the museum world. When the museum, in about 2017, shortly before I was appointed to head what was then the new Ethics Advisory Committee, published a strategic document specifying its functions and explaining how it performed. And there were 5 functions. There were 4 here, but that's because one of them should be split into 2. Because one of them is ambiguous. There were functions that I think can be recognized as how museums see themselves and what they're trying to do. The first is collection, which means 2 things. It means gathering, and it means managing a collection. So, conservation, if you will. Museums historically take stuff from the outside, bring them inside, and take care of it so that it can, second function, be interpreted through various kinds of scientific protocols, so that meaning can be given to those mute, or at least ambiguously speaking objects, so that they can be properly ventriloquized. Not as something that we look at with interest, wonder, and puzzlement, but as something that we can place in a story. Interpretation is, among other things, necessarily a narrative story. They are then displayed for various kinds of audiences in various kinds of contexts, and museums are, among other things, sets of display cases. And then they have the purpose of educating audiences, those who visit the museum, but also beyond, because museums don't simply open themselves to display. They also use what is displayed, the work of interpretation, and the various tasks involved in gathering and conserving material to provide messages to the world. The centerpiece of the French Natural History Museum, in terms of display, you've probably seen it, is La Grande Galerie d'Évolution, the Great Gallery of Evolution, which presents a range of specimens in evolutionary order in a massive hall that gives a visualization of how forms of life develop from one another over very long periods. This is typically a way of putting things that were gathered, or sometimes made to fill in gaps, because some of them are not authentically gathered from the outside but produced inside to enable the story to be told, that are then interpreted in terms of a scientific theory that needs to be made accessible to non-specialists and displayed for the purpose of educating people in the narrative. Just very standard, but in this case it is the centerpiece of the museum. So that's what museums typically do, and that means that ventriloquism is the whole point. And the ventriloquist is the specialist in relevant scientific disciplines who can not just take care of what is gathered, but also interpret it and determine conditions in which it can be displayed. The dummy is the museum itself, which speaks from the script defined by the specialist for the benefit of an audience, which is to be entertained and educated. That's what I'm calling ventriloquist performance. And it's not a criticism, it's just a description of how those constitutive functions of a museum, whether a natural history museum, an art museum, or any other kind of museum, operates. In other words, a museum, like many kinds of institutions, is a fairly trivial, obvious interlocking of practices and purposes, and the question that becomes interesting is which practices and whose purposes. Now, purposes can be political, of course, as they are in Orwell's 1984, and we might tend to regard that as a bad thing. And undoubtedly, the reforms of politicization that are bad because they reduce the ventriloquism to the transmission of an ideological framework and reduce education to propaganda. But it can also be technocratic, which isn't obviously desirable either, where the purpose is simply to ensure transmission of a framework of interpretation and analysis that is entirely confined within professional communities, which have self-referential practices that speak to other professionals, but with respect to which the audience is entirely external. The risk being, in both cases, both the political case and the technocratic case, that instead of being made visible, the ventriloquial performance is to some extent hidden, as if you could only see the dummy and not the ventriloquist. Note that when ventriloquists perform, the whole point is that you can see both. You know it's a trick. Otherwise, it will be a very deceptive performance if you could only see the dummy. And if you look at political cartoons, it's very interesting how often in political cartoons the trope emerges of the dummy on stage, the politician in this case, and someone else off stage pulling the strings, the puppeteer image, or activating the mouth, the ventriloquist image, which are basically the same image. And of course, those cartoons can be very unpleasant, and the most historically powerful form of those cartoons in Europe is anti-Semitic. The puppeteer or the ventriloquist off stage is not just someone who happens to control politicians, it's a very specific supposed conspiracy. But the form is what I want to focus on here. So a museum makes it clear that we're seeing the dummy and the ventriloquist, and that the ventriloquist has the right interpretation of what is being displayed, and we should be entertained and educated by it, and that's what a museum is for. What's interesting, of course, is how ambiguous this process can be. And I'm sure you will have examples of this from your own experience. When I, in the 1990s, as part of an exchange between my then academic institution and South African institutions, mediated by the French Embassy in South Africa, I used to go twice a year to Cape Town to teach at the University of the Western Cape, which was an extremely interesting experience, starting in 1995, just after the enactment of the Democratic Constitution and continuing to 2002. And during that period, I was, among other things, taken around National Museum in Cape Town, which was at the time in the process of being completely reimagined for obvious reasons. The previous National Museum had been a monument to apartheid, giving the veneer of scientific legitimacy to the key theses of apartheid South Africa, including the idea that every powerful group in South Africa was an invader. You know that one of the core ideas of apartheid was that the Zulus were not only invaders, but actually more recent invaders and less indigenous than the Boer population. So that the Boers who controlled Cape Town could basically designate the Zulus and the English as equally recent arrivals and equally non-indigenous in a South Africa defined primarily by them. This was, like all myths, based on certain nuggets of fact. It was also an ideological construction that had huge elements of sheer fantasy. The museum was designed to legitimize that. And in the mid-1990s, for very obvious reasons, the museum needed to be redesigned to present a different story. A museum version of the Rainbow Nation. It's very difficult because the idea of the Rainbow Nation was not really a narrative set in history, but a narrative set along another dimension of ethics and politics. And essentially a historical vision of a new South Africa to be built starting in 1994, and not the conditions in which the South Africa to be rebuilt had emerged prior to 1994. And what was fascinating visiting is that I visited at a time, I visited with someone who knew the issues very, very well, as a former ANC and Communist Party activist who'd been in prison and knew everything about the subject, a native of Cape Town. And I visited at a time when the museum was undergoing change. So you could see the new bits and the old bits, which were still cohabiting. And what's the most interesting is that all the artifacts were basically the same. As you would expect. Because they couldn't suddenly, in a year or 18 months, recollect everything. It had to be a reshuffling of existing artifacts to tell a new story. And I'm sure you can think of many examples in other places where that kind of approach was in evidence. In other words, the museum, and this chimes with what I wrote in the paper on Orwell, and perhaps you will want to read it on the basis of that and cite me and say how great it is and so on, you know. Boost my H index or whatever they call it. This is about bringing the past into the present, but as past. Not criticizing it, just describing it. There are other ways of thinking about how the past comes into the present. One of which is making the past present as present. And this is what I'd like to reflect on in the second part of this presentation. What would it mean to make the past present as present? And what are the implications for thinking about the future? Given that we have a very familiar, well-known framework of making the past present as past through collection, interpretation, and display for the purposes, among other things, of education, including popular education. And if we're looking for metaphors, which I think are useful here, the contrast is between ventriloquizing the past and metabolizing it. Metabolize, in its Greek root, literally simply means change. So to metabolize the past, by analogy with what we do when we metabolize various forms of nutrients, is both to change the inputs in order to make them assimilable, and to change oneself by the inputs one ingests. For better or for worse. When we metabolize sugar, for instance, we can do a lot of harm to ourselves, but it's still a metabolic process, where the sugar is transformed, biologically, and we are transformed by the sugar we ingest. But it can also be good, of course, and you can hardly survive without metabolizing. What would it mean to metabolize the past instead of simply ventriloquizing it? I don't have a clear answer to this. I'm just going to discuss it, and I'd be very interested in your thoughts on it. Now, there are a number of frameworks for dealing with this that don't quite work, and it's easier to see what it isn't in terms of the approach than what it is. Clearly what it isn't is antiquarianism. Sorry. Antiquarianism is precisely making the past present purely as past. It's not politically instrumentalized. It's not the world of 1984, clearly, that we should be thinking about as desirable in this regard. It's not simply exoticized either. Exoticization is to space what antiquarianism is to time, essentially. Of course, we go to museums, among other things, to say, wow, to see strange things and to be impressed by them. Impressed precisely because they're strange. But at the same time, museum organizers, scenographers, and others are very aware of the fact that one of the big traps in a museum, embedded in the material logic of display, is to reduce the museum experience to exoticization. I was very struck, for instance, by the success a few years ago of the exhibition on Ice Age art that traveled through Europe in about 2017, 2018. I didn't even such press reporting of it that I almost feel like I did see it. And what was fascinating, both in how the exhibition presented itself and in how those who attended the exhibition responded to it, was how successfully that exhibition had dealt with the threat of exoticization. Partly because the art is so remarkable and sometimes so straightforwardly representational that you don't spontaneously exoticize it. The goddesses are not straightforwardly representational, like the one that we showed us, even though that was post-Ice Age. And those do require an interpretive framework. But the animal sculptures in particular are straightforwardly representational, and we just say, wow. But the opposite risk of exoticization is excessive familiarity, which in interpretive frameworks, particularly among non-specialists, but even for specialists, is a risk. And we often tend to fall on the wrong side of that risk by assuming greater intelligibility, greater immediate understanding of distant artifacts and texts, for that matter, than they really deserve. This has been written a lot about among people who draw attention to the dangers in reading Homer as though we immediately understand him, whoever he was. Reading in translation and reading in transposition from what the words meant at the time when they were originally sung and then written down to how we read them today, and pointing to the fact that if you really can grapple with the text, which very few people can, that much of it is radically strange, even though a good translation makes it superficially very accessible. One of the classic books about this is Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue, which goes into a lot of detail on how we tend to read the ancient Greeks with a presupposition of familiarity that is actually entirely fake. We are ventriloquizing them and taking it for granted that they were basically guys like us. You know, Achilles, Patroclus, just roll up. You've all seen the movie. These were just warriors, and yeah, basically Achilles, Brad Pitt, same thing. The representation feeds into the idea that we were fundamentally all the same. Same passions, same social setting, same implicit ideas about what we're doing. And the work of McIntyre and others has been pushed back against that. And for instance, one of the most famous arguments, which is controversial, the argument that the Greeks of the Bronze Age, of the late Bronze Age, didn't actually have a sense of self in the sense in which we have one today. The development of selfhood and individuality in our contemporary sense of the word is much more recent than we think, much more connected than we realize to Romanticism, and therefore not generalizable across time or space. That didn't mean that the fighters and others of the Bronze Age weren't individuals, just that what it meant to be an individual was something very different from what it means to us today. That's controversial for all sorts of reasons. I won't go into them. But you see the idea. You see how that ventriloquial tendency or temptation constantly comes back in. In addition to not being antiquarian, not being politically instrumentalized, and not being exoticized, or the flip side, excessively familiarized, this isn't either about coming to terms with the past, to take a famous phrase associated in particular by the reflections of Jürgen Habermas on what it means to be a German in the 1990s, what it meant to be a German just after reunification in the 1990s. Coming to terms with the past is something that is really important for certain parts of history, obviously, particularly history that is still lived memory for some of the people engaged with it. But for much of what museums do, coming to terms with the past doesn't really make sense. Yes, you can extend my way back. The currently very important question in many European countries is how to come to terms with the long history of imperialism, colonialism, and slavery as a constituent part of European presence, not just pasts. And coming to terms with that past means understanding how it lives in the present, not as past, but as present. And this has given rise, as you know, to all sorts of complicated controversies about how to represent the history of slavery, which become inevitably ethical and political, not just museographical. In order to avoid all of those potential traps, I think the key is to recognize 4 kinds of boundaries that need to be called into question, challenged, and muddied. We can't overcome those boundaries completely, but we can at least denaturalize them and recognize them as the conveniences they are, not as inevitable features of what a museum must be. Those 4 kinds of boundaries are first the boundary between professionals and amateurs, secondly between present and the past, third between the various functions of a museum, and fourth between the institutional inside and the institutional outside. And this chimes very much with what we tried to develop as a framework in the NEPSARC proposal. And if we actually are lucky enough to get funded to do the NEPSARC project, then all 4 of these boundaries will, I think, be central as sites of innovation in implementing NEPSARC as Nuno presented it. The boundary between professional and amateurs isn't because professionals don't have distinctive functions. You can't imagine a purely participatory, self-organized museum where everyone collects stuff, everyone takes care of it, everyone interprets it, and everyone decides what to display. For better or worse, a museum makes choices about display which are inscribed in an interpretive framework that needs at some level to be decided on, and which depends on professional practices to collect and to conserve, without which the museum ceases to be able to perform its functions. What Luis was telling us in that branch was very interesting about the fact that many of the artifacts collected by the collector, whose personal collection was the starting point of the museum, were actually fake. And that's what would tend to happen if there were no professional protocols around collecting and conserving material. Though fakes can be very interesting as fakes, but in order to make them interesting as fakes, you need to be able to categorize them clearly as such, and perhaps display them as such. And as you know, there have been some interesting attempts in art history in particular to include forgeries in exhibitions, showing, for instance, how copies of paintings circulate, contribute to the visibility and fame of the original painting, differ from it, create economic circuits around forgeries, the ambiguous boundary, at least historically, between a forgery and a copy. Today, these things are supposedly clarified by intellectual property, but intellectual property was basically invented in the 1830s. It didn't exist for much of the period that is displayed in our museums in terms of visual arts. So when is a copy a forgery? Is Australian Pink Floyd a forgery of Pink Floyd? No, because it doesn't hide the fact that it's a copy. But that zone can become very grey. When Roger Daltrey and Pete, sorry, this isn't really prog, but I'm doing my best to work in the musical references. When Roger Daltrey and Pete Townsend tour as The Who today, with an orchestra and with much diminished vocal capacity, are they still really The Who? Are they copying The Who, covering The Who, forging The Who? And you know there have been some very big fights among bands on this issue. When Roger Waters left Pink Floyd, he tried to stop David Gilmour using the brand Pink Floyd. The lawsuit dragged on for years. That's why there was no Pink Floyd album for about 6 years after the final cut. Effectively, Waters was saying that Pink Floyd without me is a forgery, and Gilmour was saying it's a legitimate continuation of something we did together, and now you've gone, we can go on. There's no simple answer to that question. There's obviously the legal answer was given. Pink Floyd was allowed to tour and put out records as Pink Floyd without Waters, who's been very bitter about it ever since, to the point of remaking Dark Side of the Moon. I don't know if you saw, that's a fascinating story which I won't go into, but Dark Side of the Moon, 1973, perhaps the single most famous prog album, which many of you may have heard, at least in part. Is there anyone who's never heard any part of Dark Side of the Moon? Confirming my point. Roger Waters, as you perhaps know, released at the end of 2023 a remake of Dark Side of the Moon, which nearly everyone hated. I haven't listened to it myself. What is it? A copy, a forgery, a new word? Very interesting questions about authenticity, which I'm using prog rock as a hook to hang things on. And perhaps the most fascinating case is Yes. I won't go into the details. Is there anyone who hasn't heard of the band Yes? Clearly not. Look at the makeup of Yes, how they tour, what they release. The whole thing is a complete stinking mess of chaos. Yes, depending on which year you see them, could be almost any group of about 12 musicians in any combination. It could be a different guitar player, different singer, different drummer, different keyboard player, different bass player, since the historic bass player has died. But even when he was still alive, he didn't necessarily tour with Yes. Someone owns the brand, Steve Howe, but who exactly Yes is has become completely indeterminate. So what's the original? What's the copy? Prog, parenthesis closed, but you see where I'm going with this, and it actually goes to the heart of the question of what it is to make the past present. Now, in overcoming those boundaries between professionals and amateurs, between the present and the past, which deserves a small comment, the past starts now. Yesterday was the past. The beginning of this presentation was the past. You know, St. Augustine's famous disquisition about what's the past. If If you don't ask me, I know instinctively, but as soon as you ask me, I can't define it. Paraphrasing Augustine's famous words. The beginning of this sentence was already past, which means that the idea of a sharp division between past and present is actually one of the myths on which the historical sciences depend, including the underpinning of the museum, and it's actually pretty arbitrary. But if the past is present in the present, then we have to rethink the ways in which we make it present, not simply for the very recent past. Clearly the very beginning of this lecture exists only in the memory of those present here. There's no other trace of it, and it may be quickly forgotten, though not, I hope, the person I was eulogizing in that introduction. I hope no one's forgotten him in the minutes since I started talking. But even then, if there's no written trace, that may be forgotten. It follows from that the future also starts now. And indeed, there is a blurring ambiguity, since what we do in the present, which immediately becomes past, is oriented towards a future which in the meantime gradually becomes present. And this isn't complicated, tricksy metaphysics, it's just basic human experience. When I started this presentation, I had some plan scribbled down in my notebook on where it was going. It was oriented by a future. Whether I followed the plan, only I know, you don't. And the answer is no. As always, I haven't really followed the plan. But the point is that the future exists as projection in the same way as exists as intrusion in the only thing that actually exists, which is the present. I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, in my title, I use the word multiverse. And the reason for using this word is precisely to emphasize the possibility that we might rethink museums and their functions and how they relate to their audiences and to what they represent in terms of multiple parallel simultaneous modes of existence, and I will discuss in a moment of possibility, which is what physicists who like those kinds of ideas call the multiverse. The way it was used in the Spider-Man films and so on comes from serious physical theorizing from physicists who basically can't see any reason in the fundamental equations that govern the universe why there should be just one universe. So the assumption is that there are multiple universes. But those multiple universes don't communicate with one another in any ordinary sense of the word. Because by definition, if you could travel from one to the other, then they will be part of the same universe. So the multiverse is a superposition of possibilities that coexist and in principle don't communicate, but can be made to communicate. And there was a hit movie about this, which was literally called Everything Everywhere All at Once, if I remember right. Some of you may have seen it. And of course, if you try to make this into a film, it becomes very confusing, because if everything is everywhere all at once, it's actually impossible to represent it. But we can maybe find compromises that allow that impossible mishmash of multiplicity to be figurable. And among those possibilities and those compromises are new forms of technologies, which is why we put the idea of a virtual museum at the heart of Mação. Not just a virtual museum creating a museum that is simply displayed online, but is otherwise identical to a traditional museum, but a museum that uses technology to be more than just a different way of displaying. What exactly this means, we will only know if we get to implement the project. But we have an idea of why it's worth trying, and some of the directions in which one could go. Technology offers new ways of doing things that allow experimentalism, indeterminacy, to enter a museum space that is typically highly determined by the professional processes that have shaped it. And here, I think, this is probably probably important for them, but I can't recall that we specifically discussed it. Science museums offer an interesting example of how, even within the existing museum world, that space of experimentalism can be integrated. When you go to a science museum, typically you can do things with what's displayed beyond simply looking at them. You can make your hair stand on end with a Van de Graaff generator, for instance. Van de Graaff generator, prog band. You can touch strange kinds of materials with odd physical properties and so on. And within certain limits, you can maybe even create a chemical explosion that's been carefully calibrated so it's not dangerous and so on. Science museums build this into the logic of the museum. Other kinds of museums typically don't. But they could. It's not impossible in principle. And technology can facilitate this. By contrast, technology is often seen just as an adjunct to the usual ways of doing things, an enhancement but not a transformation. I think our challenge, an exciting one, is to think about how technology could be transformative and not simply ameliorative. I have a lot of stuff on these 2 pages. I don't know how much time it's reasonable to devote to it. When should I end?
There's still time.
Still
You
time.
can take 20 minutes.
Now, what I'm saying here may sound very radical, perhaps unrealistically and unnecessarily so, particularly at a time when cultural institutions are often under threat, including politically and financially. And I'm involved in other work, in working with cultural institutions and their representatives, and it's clear that the last thing many of them would want at a difficult time is to be told that they have to completely shake everything up and cease performing the functions that are credible and legitimate with respect to their funders, to invent something new that funders might not like and which might lead the museum to be destroyed. So this is tricky, but at the same time, we can't stop thinking about stuff just because there might be risks in thinking and just because we're unsure how the thoughts might be followed up on in reality. What I like to think is that it's possible to be transformative without uprooting everything. I think this is how I would recognize the various pragmatic parts of this challenge. The challenge is perhaps rather to create cracks to let the light in. And by letting the light in, create the conditions of gradual transformation from within. Not reshaping things from outside, which is just a new version of the technocratic project, but allowing things organically to transform themselves. And those familiar with ancient music know that cracks to let the light in is a quote from Leonard Cohen. Does everyone know who Leonard Cohen is?
Of course.
Nearly everyone, but not literally everyone. That's interesting. Everyone knows Dark Side of the Moon, but not everyone knows Leonard Cohen. You can look him up on YouTube. It's slightly depressing music, but great words. No? You don't find it slightly depressing sometimes?
Not at all.
No, but maybe because I like that kind of.
Some of his late stuff is really, particularly when he couldn't sing anymore, it's not an uplifting experience. Once he lost his voice. Anyway.
Yeah.
We can do some Leonard Cohen covers once we have a guitar with that music. In other words, creating the cracks to let the light in, that will encourage positive tensions and instabilities that will enable, but not mandate, change. And a key in this respect is precisely the future. Once we accept that the past is ever present, as constantly ending, and therefore in a sense never quite ending, as constantly open to revision and interpretation, as metabolized into who we are individually and collectively, then 2 things I think become reasonably clear. First, the past, subject to certain conditions, including material and institutional conditions, is living and present. Not just through our gaze on it as an external object, but through how it lives metabolically in us, individually, collectively, and the collectives are numerous, indeterminate, and overlapping. And the future is exactly for the same reason, living and present, not as prediction or as plan, but as possibility. Indeed, the future is simply another word for possibility. In the same way that freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. See, I'm working a quote in from a famous song called Me and Bobby McGee. Best known in its cover version by Janis Joplin, even though it was originally written and recorded by Chris Christopherson. The fact that in popular music, the cover versions are sometimes better known and artistically better than the originals is a reminder that authenticity is not simply a matter of origins and roots and primacy. It's something else. I don't think anyone would say that Janis Joplin's version of Me and Bobby McGee, again, look it up on YouTube, is inauthentic simply because it was a cover. To be kept in mind. What I'm talking about, in other words, is presentism, which is usually seen as a bad thing. Presentism, I don't know if it's really used in English, but it's certainly used in French, is a focus on the present, neglecting the importance of the past and the future. What I'm suggesting here is precisely the opposite, a presentism that recognizes the enormous importance of the past and future as components of the present. It's a view that everything is present, but not necessarily in the same way. And this is precisely, as I said, a multiverse idea, the idea of operating along several timelines at once and straddling overlapping spheres of possibility. This is a challenge for museums and for many other kinds of institutions, precisely because of all the boundaries it erases, including the boundaries between professional and amateur, the boundary between present and past, the boundary between inside and outside the institution, and the boundary between the various functions: collection, display, interpretation, education. But at the same time, it's a major opportunity, I think, for museums of all kinds to play a role in some of the major challenges we face, which are challenges about possibilities, frightening and exciting. The possibilities of environmental transformation, which are frightening if we don't deal with them, because we could simply, like many civilizations have been through recorded history, destroyed by the transformation of our environment. Of course, we're maybe slightly more resilient than the North Koreans, who failed to survive the sharp drop in temperatures in the 14th century. But how resilient are we? Obviously, the IPCC has done a lot of work on this. How bad might what about 3 degrees? It's clearly not a linear process. Is there a point where societal collapse becomes a real possibility embedded in the change? It's not the warming that matters per se, it's the change of the conditions compared to the conditions from which our current structures of physical infrastructure, which can be vulnerable obviously to all kinds of environmental impacts, rising sea levels for instance, vis-a-vis coastal cities. So our more infrastructures are ways of relating to the world. Similarly, the possibilities, that's the negative side, but the positive side is the possibility that by transforming how we relate to the environmental systems in which we are embedded, we might actually create something more resilient, more sustainable, in which human beings could flourish better precisely because they recognize the flourishing of others, non-humans, within the system. Both concrete others, tigers, and abstract others, oceans. But the oceans are concrete in one sense, but what we call ocean is a complicated interlocking set of systems, physical, biological, geochemical, and so on, that flourish as a kind of abstraction, or biodiversity, which is clearly an abstraction. Similarly, the possibilities of technology, large language models, perhaps tending towards forms of machine intelligence, or perhaps not. The possibilities are exciting and terrifying. Partly because we know that when we invent things, they're likely, at least initially, to escape our control. And yet, if we control them too early, we'll never invent them. So grasping the positive possibilities demands taking the risk of the negative possibilities. Regulators are trying to grapple with this with very different approaches. People in East Asia tend to be much more relaxed about non-human intelligence, perhaps because monotheism creates a specific framework within which non-human intelligence has a certain negative meaning. Europe is much more cautious than North America, and so you know all these things. But the key point is that these are spaces of possibility, and these spaces of possibility need to be grasped as such. Again, not to be planned, predicted, or controlled, but to be inhabited as multiversal spaces of possibility. What can museums do about that? Demography, another interesting example. We are the oldest human society that has ever existed globally, and the fastest aging. We're also very diverse as a global society in terms of our relation to aging, which creates fears, pressures, dynamics of migration and redistribution of wealth and economic dynamism that need to be dealt with. Trying to predict this is completely pointless. Of course, you can do predictions in a mathematical sense, and they can guide reflection, but they don't say anything about the future. They say everything about the present. One of the most striking developments in the history of the past 30 years is changes in demographic outlooks. The UN publishes them about every 15 years or so. In the mid-1990s, the projections, which are basically just extrapolations of current fertility trends and so on, showed the global population peaking at 12.5 billion in about 2100. The most recent systematic outlooks of the UN, published shortly before the pandemic, show the global population peaking at 9 billion in about 2070. And some people have noticed how radical that change is, but I think it's not been sufficiently commented on. The peak population has been reduced by 2.5 billion in about 20 years. That's a reminder first that the 1990s outlook wasn't any kind of prediction about the future. It was simply a formalization of facts about the present. And it shows how fast even demographics can change. And demographics is one of the most inertial parts of human societies because the generational cycle is fairly long. If that can change that fast, then imagine how fast everything else can change. And how vacuous are our attempts to capture the future within, like a butterfly within a net, through our supposed capacities for mathematical extrapolation. In other words, what is at stake is to imagine the museum of now. But now, as I just defined it, including the past and the present, the museum of now look like. I think we have some interesting ideas here, but none of them add up in themselves to a complete picture. But we don't need one. What we need is cracks, which means experimentation. Opportunities to try new things that might gradually, organically, expand, develop, transform themselves, and have systemic impacts. Let me, in closing, and thinking about how the functions of a museum, gather, conserve, interpret, display, educate, the 5 core functions of any museum, can be profoundly transformed once one imagines a museum of now, which is also necessarily, because it erodes the barrier between inside and outside the institution, a museum that is not simply the production by professionals of a narrative for the education, edification, and entertainment of an audience, but the co-construction by a community of its relation to now, including the past. Time capsules are a long-standing way of thinking about these issues. We did one with kids at UNESCO in 2012 in celebration of World Philosophy Day, taking advantage of the fact that 2012 was both the year of the Rio Plus 20 Conference on Sustainable Development and the 15th anniversary of the UNESCO Declaration on the responsibilities of present generations towards future generations. A declaration that was not widely recognized and had largely become obsolete, so we decided to give it some visibility in 2012. And with school kids in France, at a very small experimental scale, we made some time capsules, which are buried at the entrance to UNESCO. The metal cylinders are supposed to be opened in 2062, if UNESCO still exists, and if anyone preserves the memory of where they're actually buried. No guarantee of either of those two things. But what's interesting when you do that kind of exercise is that the key question, which school children at a young age grasp very instinctively, is how can we talk to kids not yet born? In what language? What will be meaningful for them? What do they need to know about us? In other words, what the time capsule creates is an imaginary conversation that brings the future into the present. And there's no easy answer to any of those questions, but thinking about them is remarkably productive. And the school kids, who were ages 8, 9, 10, came up, for instance, with the question, what will kids my age in 2062 eat? And of course no one knows, so I animated one of these discussions myself, others were animated by the teachers and so on. No one knows what they will eat in 2062. But let's at least show them what we eat today. So there's some canned food in the... What that will mean in 2062 is completely indeterminate. But what it meant in 2012 was surprisingly clear and interesting. Counterfactuality is also something that has become fashionable in historiography. It's very difficult because we don't have clear protocols for it in intellectual terms, and it can easily become sheer bullshit. What if Napoleon had won at Waterloo? It's very easy to bullshit about that. But perhaps we can be more rigorous about it. Perhaps we can use numerical simulations to introduce a degree of rigor into the counterfactual possibilities. We were discussing Charles Lindbergh yesterday. I can't remember in what context. But as you know, Charles Lindbergh might have won the 1940 US presidential election, in which case the US perhaps would not have fought in the Second World War. And because Lindbergh was basically the spokesperson of the fascist movement, the US might have moved to a form of fascism quite similar to the European forms of fascism of the day. And Philip Roth wrote a famous novel, which is precisely that counterfactual novel, What If Lindbergh Had Won? Again, maybe we can be a bit more rigorous about this. Counterfactuality is a way of inscribing the space, the multiverse of possibilities into the present. Not as a purely exotic exercise where we can say, wow, weren't we lucky? Or wow, what did we miss out on? But to understand that the present is that space of unresolved possibilities. We often want to enclose the future in a prediction. Either Russia will win the war in Ukraine or Russia will lose. You have no idea, no one does. The issue is how the possibilities, of which there are more than two, obviously, shape the present, and by shaping the present, shape the future, and therefore recursively increase or decrease the likelihood of certain outcomes, and create possibilities that we can't even imagine today. Maybe there are ways in which museums can contribute to that, using technology and using new ideas. And deep history also goes to the heart of this. I'm sure you're familiar with one of the interesting tracks that were followed in deep history research, which was the question of how we can make nuclear waste disposal sites secure. including the very simple question of signage. If we create waste repositories, then they need to be secured over many centuries, far beyond the duration of our existing institutions. And this brings us back to the time capsule and the kids wondering about kids 50 years down the line, without certain knowledge of what language people in the future will speak. So how do you create safety signs that need to have a duration of a minimum of 300 years? This has been done. It's been done as an experimental project, bringing together engineers, anthropologists, philosophers, linguists, and so on, to try to think about what it might be to secure sites over a very long period. That is essentially a museum of the future approach, which is quite similar to the question, very controversial within the International Stratigraphic Commission, whether there should or could be a stratigraphic definition of the Anthropocene. The basic intuition of the Anthropocene, humans forming planetary systems, is clear enough. But could you make it a stratigraphic category? And if so, how? And of course, because they can't agree, this has actually been temporarily voted down. There was a whole polemic about whether the vote took place in acceptable conditions given the rules of procedure. But the key issue is that thinking about a stratigraphic definition is an archaeology of the future approach. It's asking what would hypothetical archaeologists hundreds of thousands of years down the line use as a marker to identify the beginning of the Anthropocene. And the question is much more interesting than the answer. The answer is ultimately arbitrary. The question is extremely interesting. And it's a museum question, but it's a museum of the future question. A museum of possibilities question. So, that's what I would like to put to you as a challenge. Let's imagine a museum of now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Questions, observations, others? I wouldn't like to start myself. You mean you want to say?
I can say something.
Yes, go ahead.
It's not a question, it's more a comment. But while I was listening about the authenticity and fakeness dichotomy, immediately came to my mind a book by Umberto Eco, which is Travels in Hyperreality, in which he, in his own travels, he finds that, for example, depending on the culture, it can be Western culture as well, the fake can be seen as much better than the actual thing. And this was in a museum, oh, thank you, in a museum in the United States that holds pieces which are fakes of ancient Greece, for example. So it's they can get much closer to David, for example, than they would. They're not as protected because that's no problem. You can make another one if that one goes rotten or if it's no longer viewed better. But it's it even gives you the opportunity to touch the pieces, which you cannot do if they're the original ones. So this was just something that came to my mind.
Yeah, I agree. This is a very important issue, which we have an intuitive idea of fake versus authentic that actually doesn't survive detailed analysis. And my musical examples were partly just because we agreed to talk about music, but also because they point to some interesting issues. We think we know what authentic means, and it goes to an idea of authorship. But the idea of authorship doesn't really resist detailed analysis. And that's what's really interesting. And what you say about replicas, and of course, when is a replica a replica? When does it become a fake? Is itself an interesting question. Many medieval cathedrals were built with stone that is very fragile, porous, and very likely to be damaged by acid. a major source of stone damaging acid, and it's called pigeons. I visited Strasbourg very recently and saw the cathedral. A lot of the statuary on Strasbourg Cathedral is replicas, which might be considered fake. Why? Because the originals are too fragile. They're preserved in a museum across the square. So when you take the originals off the cathedral to keep them safe and put them elsewhere, and replace them by replicas that are made from more durable material, what are you doing in terms of the authenticity of the museum? Of the cathedral, sorry. And the answer is I'm not sure. It's just an interesting space of question. And it's where the conservation function of the museum can clash with the display function. As you said, even in very conventional museums, very fragile artifacts, even within protected display cases, are often replaced by replicas because the originals are too fragile to be displayed. And this is explained, a little note explaining it. But still, what are you seeing? And of course, you're not seeing something that is completely fake because the replica derives from the interpretive framework and the conservation process. So it's saying something about the original, perhaps by imitating it in a way that is visually perfect, but still. And we had this discussion the other day, I think with Zoltan, as a result of his presentation, the question of what to do with ruins. And clearly what we're trying to preserve is often a ruin. But we want to preserve it in a stable ruined state. Whereas the whole point of ruins is that they are not stable in time. They are decaying. But how do you preserve the decay? And we had a conversation, which I had in the session, but following on from Zoltan's presentation on industrial buildings, sites. Obviously, people, particularly sponsors and funders and public authorities, are very resistant to the idea that we should let things decay and watch them decay. But that's the authenticity, actually, of the object. And when we're talking about industrial architecture, particularly rust, eventually, yeah, rust will destroy a building made of metal, and perhaps require it to be demolished because it's become unsafe. Unless you can have a quite wide perimeter that allows it to collapse without endangering anything else. And this is not what the people who fund conservation activities want to see. They want to see things frozen at a certain point in time. And from then on, preserved, not in an original state, but in a state that just happens to be the state that prevailed at the moment the decision was made to conserve it. And once you put it in those terms, it becomes a very interesting discussion, which actually transcends the distinction between fake and authentic, the distinction between original and replica. And it goes to the heart of the heritage issues that UNESCO struggles with, which are often precisely about in what state exactly should something be preserved. And this becomes even more challenging in rebuilding. Should we restore, which means rebuild, the Buddhas of Bamyan in Afghanistan, which were dynamited by the Taliban in about 20 years ago? This is tricky because the rebuilt statues will not in any sense be the statues that were destroyed. They could be visually similar at the same site and inscribed in the history. But the history of the destruction is very important too, and shouldn't be erased. So how do you get the balance there? The most famous thing UNESCO ever did was Aswan. The statues when the Aswan Dam was built, and it was going to flood a valley where the temple of Abu Simbel was located. This was in the early 1960s, and UNESCO raised $30 million of the day through a public subscription. First time UNESCO's ever done that. First and only time UNESCO ever did that, to save the statues of Apheleia. But it's very interesting how they were saved. They were saved first by being cut into pieces. And you can see the films, it's very interesting. It was fairly easily manipulable sandstone. So you see the guys with saws literally cutting the statues into pieces and then transporting them 150 kilometers to a new site. So what was this exactly? The stone, in a sense, but with the joins, because these weren't originally cut into pieces. So when the stone was preserved, the visual representation of the pharaohs and dignitaries, yeah, in a sense. Why were the statues transported rather than high-quality replicas being made? Which goes to the heart of your question. Why was it felt important to transport the original stone? Lots of questions. I don't have answers, but they're really interesting questions about the very nature, the conservation enterprise, and a reminder that you can't simply say collect, conserve, interpret, display, educate, as though this was a linear process of functions. Because the way in which things are conserved, and indeed the way in which things are collected, depends on choices about interpretive frameworks and ultimately choices about the educational function of the museum. We were discussing the question of Paleolithic and pre-human remains in the Philippines, many of which have not been explored. So where do you dig? And as you were saying, someone has to pay for it. So you need to convince someone to pay for a dig to find exciting artifacts in places where they might be located. But the way you get them to pay for it is starting from the end, starting from what can be displayed and for what purpose, in other words, within what interpretive framework. So what is collected is always already pre-interpreted, in fact. But of course, when we try to be methodologically rigorous, we are open to the idea that what we find might challenge our prior interpretive framework. Of course, but still.
Anyone else?
Sultan.
Sorry, because I don't have eyes.
Yeah, thank you. There are many interesting considerations and food for thought. Just wanted to reflect on one thing regarding these transported sites or ruins or remains. I think there is a very fortunate concept regarding this, and that is the sightedness. So how these ruins are embedded in the particular site where they originally are. And this is something that you cannot really recreate in other places that have been in open air space, like in the case of Abu Simbel, or for example, you transport the Pergamon altar to the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, so you can keep the original stones in pretty good condition, and perhaps they survive better there than being constantly under rain and wind and snow and whatever you have. But still, you cannot authentically recreate that particular sightedness or place of where the ruins or these remains originally come from. So that's one thing always to consider when thinking about moving a building or a fragment. And the other thing that came to my mind regarding the fragility of the object and the role of the museum, there is a very interesting example that I recently saw in this new monk museum in Oslo, where they exhibited 3 different versions of the famous Scream, that is one of the best known works by monk, and of course they are quite light sensitive. So what they did is that they exhibited the 3 of them in a small room, quite dark room, but it's always only one that is visible for like 1 hour, and the other 2 are closed, like with a moving small piece of cover. So the visitors, if they want to see all of them, necessarily have to spend at least 3 hours in the museum. That is not the case, because sometimes if you're like rushing, then you just go through the museum in like half an hour. But in that case, it's a very good way of keeping the visitor inside if they are interested in all the free version. Thank you.
Anyone? Yes.
Well, my question goes to the issue of purpose. So, because you refer to the 5 missions of the museum, but then should we start by the issue of what is the purpose of the exhibition? So, for instance, when I go to the Louvre and I see the Mona Lisa, hundreds of people in front of it just to take a selfie, but they actually are not appreciating it. So what is the purpose of the museum, and what rests in between the observer and the object that is observed? Because there is room also for interpretation, not only of the curator, not only of the person that will organize the narrative of the museum. And that's why you have in South Africa the same objects telling different stories, because they were organized in different ways. But there is also the visitor that has an interpretation and that relates with the object that is being exhibited. And so, if we start by thinking what is the purpose of exhibiting equivalent, then probably we can understand this thing of moving the stones instead of, or observing fakes. Is my pleasure, will I be deceived if I see an object that is a fake or not? Do I really care? Or is it my experience of seeing something? Does it add value if that something is the real thing or not? If I go to Strasbourg and in fact I see the statues there, and if I don't know that they were replaced, does that bother me? Does that change the experience? To what extent is that the museum is not a place of experience, exclusively, not exclusive, but an important space of experience, and then how does that change all the other variables that you were relating?
I agree, those are key questions, and I think at the heart of it is the question, experience of what? And of course a cathedral is an interesting example of that, because I think we have probably difficulties instinctively in relating to what a cathedral is. Even though the literature presents it often very clearly, Strasbourg Cathedral, just the most recent one I visited, like many Gothic cathedrals in Europe, a very complicated overlaying of multiple projects unfolding over many centuries, constrained by politics, by money, in ways that mean that you're seriously engaging with the cathedral, you're engaging with something organic that has developed without overall coherence. And once you make that point, then maybe that's one of the things you need to experience. We have trouble understanding this because stuff gets built these days in a few years, and basically to an original plan, except when someone goes bankrupt and it can't get finished. But that's not how cathedrals were built, at all. Strasbourg Cathedral, like some other cathedrals, was never finished. It has only one spire. Same with the Basilica of Saint-Denis in northern Paris, the place of burial of the kings of France. It was never finished. There's only one spire. Why is it not finished? Because the bishop ran out of money. Definitively ran out of money. They were always running out of money. So, to engage with a cathedral as though it had an authentic state with respect to which any intervention would be a forgery or fake, is actually untrue to what a cathedral is. And that's not true of everything, of course. The Mona Lisa has a certain state, which is, as far as we know, the state in which the painter desired it to be finished. And on that basis, you're either seeing the original or you're seeing the replica. So I think we have to open up the spaces of possibilities, recognizing that we have very naive, instinctive views about what is real and what is fake, what is authentic and what is a forgery and so on. And opening up that space of a more pluralistic understanding of what it is to display things, which, among other things, means making explicit the purpose. Too often the purpose is implicit, particularly in national museums, the implicit purpose being to underpin nation building. But if we make the purpose more explicit, we can call it into question, we can pluralize it, we can problematize it. I think that's sort of the direction in which it would be relevant to go. And of course the status of the Mona Lisa in the Louvre is deeply problematic in terms of any coherent understanding of museum organization, because people come to see that. They pass amazing artworks because they're only interested in seeing the famous thing, which you can't actually see because it's very small, very protected, and very crowded. So what you're seeing is what exactly? So that question, experience of what, should be at the center, but as a problem, as a question, not as an answer, I think.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. So for me, it was very enlightening. So you presented a lot of concepts that for me are new. So I definitely will read more about what you read about this. And connecting with this, I just want to a question, because I am very interested in this question about the virtual museum. What do you envision for the virtual museum using artificial intelligence or augmented reality, and so with, for example, an immersive experience in the metaverse, for example, and how it can connect these questions about authenticity, fake, and fragility also with the digital data, because we know that it's extremely fragile. How can we think about all of these questions as well? And if you have something about this.
Yeah, I have some ideas, none of them are definitive. One thing I'd like to emphasize, which I said, but I'd really like to say it again, is that the piece of displaying better. For instance, enabling people to see the artifacts without physically coming to the museum. That can be valuable. Why not? If we want more sustainable tourism, then maybe we should give people the opportunity to see things without traveling to see them. But I think the really valuable contribution of technology is to go a step further. Not simply to be part of the traditional process, but to change the process itself. And in that respect, what I find most exciting is the idea of alternatives, which are very difficult to display in a conventional mode, but quite easy to do with technology, so long as you have the right mindset. Showing something that's quite common now, different states of an object, for instance, how it changed over time, which is quite easy to do. But you can also apply this to uncertainties about interpretive frameworks, showing alternative interpretations of the same object, and you can connect objects to other objects and showing how the connections create interpretive uncertainties. And I think counterfactuality is a really exciting space, but it requires very strong methodologies that we don't currently have. Because again, most alternative history, most counterfactual history is just bullshit. It's novelizing. It can be great fun to read, but it doesn't actually tell you very much about the history itself. Can develop serious, rigorous methodologies for counterfactuality. If we can, then technology will be indispensable in order to display it. Another aspect is that for logistical reasons, museums tend to be frozen. You can't keep changing them, it's just too expensive. So you have to freeze them in a certain state for a fairly long period of time, at least as regards permanent exhibitions. There was something very interesting in that ranch which we drew our attention to, which is the fact that at least one of the rooms displaying the donation of a collector, the name of which I can't remember, is deliberately designed to rotate. So it's not a permanent exhibition of specific artworks, it's a permanent exhibition of a subset of a donated collection, which is interesting, first because it avoids the trap that most museum collections are never seen by anyone because they're in storerooms, and secondly, opens up the question of what the collection was, not equating the collection with the display choice. But even that, I imagine, is quite logistically demanding because someone has to carry things and rehang things and check lighting and possibly poke holes in walls and so on. You can't do it all the time with physical display. With virtual display, it's much easier. So that maybe instead of the Mona Lisa being always in the same place and creating a kind of black hole of attraction to the detriment of other artworks, you can rotate things virtually. You can keep changing it. Maybe indeed you could imagine a display where the Mona Lisa is randomly relocated, maybe every hour, like with the Munch version. So in this case it was Munch who created several versions of the same painting, which means that looking for the Mona Lisa wouldn't be just a matter of following the plan or the guidebook, but actually visiting the museum. Where is she? And by looking for her, you will actually look at all the other stuff. There's no way you can do that physically. It's quite easy to do virtually. So I think that that's the exciting challenge. Not to use technology in order to enhance the same experience, but to use it in order to open the question, experience of what?
Anyone else?
This is a matter of experimenting. There's no master plan. But if we can find sites of experimentation, maybe we can do some really interesting stuff that will have consequences beyond the space of experimentation itself.
Any other comments? Yes.
I was wondering about the concept of the museum being a multiverse. Is it
Sorry,
something?
I didn't hear.
I'm sorry. I was wondering about if.
The microphone will
Thank you. If the concept of the multiverse.
It's not working.
It's not working.
The mic doesn't seem to be amplifying.
I was wondering if the concept of the multiverse, like the museum as a multiverse, is something that is around the museum, managing the museum, and like organizing museology as a general concept, or if it is something that you think of that can be concretely seen also in the museum visitors, like the displays being multiverse. Because you mentioned, and I have seen the film as well of Everything Everywhere All at Once, and like you say, it has been very confusing to see all the things that were happening in the past, present, possibilities, all happening simultaneously. So, if this is a concept that you can imagine inside the museum as a content.
Yes, I can imagine it. I'm not sure exactly how easy it is to do technologically, and I'm not sure how to maintain an experience that is fun. Because if it's not fun, people won't do it. So that might be challenging, and there are people who, with the technical skills that I don't have, who could perhaps comment on how to do this. But again, what's interesting, instead of freezing an artifact at a particular point in time, is providing it with rich metadata, which is precisely what the technology can do. Metadata about where it comes from, what it used to look like, what it might look like in future as it decays, what kinds of uses it might have been put to, including reuses, because we know that many things were created at one point and subsequently reused. I mentioned the fact that Roman buildings were mined for stones to build cathedrals, for instance. That reuse is part of the history of those stones, the fact that they were used in different contexts at different times. And there's no way in traditional representation of representing that layering of possible dimensions of metadata. So technology makes it, in principle, easy. Easy to structure the metadata. Displaying, I think there's no technological barrier. The question is, how can you make this accessible, interesting, fun, educational, relevant? One thing that I suspect many professionals might be uncomfortable with is that it destabilizes interpretive frameworks. It becomes harder to have a museum path. You know, how there are little arrows that tell you to go here. It makes it harder to inscribe the artifact within the narrative. But that's probably what we should be doing. And I was very interested, Luis, in the way you showed fairly minimalist interpretive frameworks on the wall, explaining why it was part of the whole experience not to overburden the visitor with complex interpretive frameworks, rather to create a space where the interpretation could be much more open. And that has been the tendency in museums. They used to be, particularly national museums, used to be pretty, we say in French, avec des gros sabots, with big clogs on their feet, really telling you exactly which story they want you to remember. We have generally, I think, moved away from that, and we can move away a lot further. Not by removing the functions of collection, conservation, interpretation, but by opening up those issues through new modes of display. I think this is the idea I have. And we wrote this into Mação, and of course the bit that's easy is, with new technology, having rich metadata is easy. It might be time consuming, but there's no difficulty. The question is what you do with the rich metadata, and that's challenging.
Anyone else? If not, I just wanted to make one or two comments because your lecture is, as usual, very inspiring. So, and in general, I agree with you. You raise a certain number of issues that recurrently come back in humanities discussions. And I think if a summary, this was my first note, what you said is a good example, a very good example, of why a humanities approach is important. Because in the end, for example, in this discussion about the museum, it is possible to, I think first of all that most museographers are very naive. They believe people read the text, very much text, because it's fine, I'm a Catholic, so I'm a believer, and most people think I'm stupid, so it's okay. So, but in fact, when I visit the museum, I tend not to read the long text because I prefer books, and I think that those who are not experts want to read text because they don't read them anyway. So you have to construct a visual intellectual itinerary, which of course has the danger of losing any sort of reference. But if you highlight with a few words and if you design things, maybe you will be successful. But this is one of the cases. Abu Simbel was another example. This has been discussed. And for example, the fact that, for example, Foscoa is actually a mindset change in relation to conservation. Because in Abu Simbel, you didn't have a landscape understanding. And a few decades, about 2 decades later or so, you have, because the idea of cutting the rocks in Portugal came, there was a suggestion, there was even an attempt to the electricity company with some people of conservation cut rocks to demonstrate it was technically possible, and of course it was technically possible. The issues of conservation are very interesting. When I was listening to you, I remember a discussion a few years ago about Lascaux, because you know this very well. There was a problem of Lascaux, and then there was a commission that Jean-Claude had suggested to assess the problem of conservation, and I was in the final evaluation of that team, and it was a fantastic discussion, because the geology. When you were speaking, I had a question mark here. Is John Crowley a biologist? Because the discussion was this. The geologists, like my friend Pierluigi, I don't know if he's around today, but the geologists were trying to go back to the past and to freeze. That's what many people in conservation, who are primarily from other sciences and physics, chemistry, they try to freeze time. And they were saying, okay, we have this fungus, we change the machine, we rebalance, we do this and that. And the biologists were saying life is not about that. A cave is a living environment. So whatever you do, you cannot predict the future. It was very interesting, because it was primarily a discussion of natural scientists, but the biologists looked like philosophers, and the geologists looked like geologists. So and I think this is largely a discussion. And my last reflection here, it's not really questions, but it was notes that I took. Even this idea of guessing about the future. When will the climate change become whatever? When will we all die, and so on? I think we've heard it through history quite frequently. And then for the last 200 years, to a certain extent, it went down. The last 200 years, after Enlightenment, the idea of progress, of future, has been very strong. And now it's going down again. And it's interesting that one of the interesting investments of Enlightenment is precisely the idea of a rationalist. And if you have a rationalist, if you understand how complex the past is, you understand that you cannot really guess exactly what happened in the past. And this allows you, we always say, even I say that, understanding the past allows you to, expanding the past allows you to expand the future. So utopia, I said it a couple of days ago here. But listening to you, maybe there's more into it. You build utopia knowing that it will never be like that. And the danger of today is because you have destroyed the idea of a common past. You have replaced it by a common in the sense of intellectual, which is never the reality, an agreement. It's a negotiated agreement. And because of that, you have replaced the idea of utopia with a series of goals. We will get there, otherwise we will get that somewhere else, but we know exactly where we are going. So, okay, these were my reflections, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Just a word on that. In reference to the UNESCO program that I used to manage, it wasn't my program intellectually, it was the Futures Literacy program, managed and indeed largely created by my colleague Leo Miller, who used to work in my team when we were both at UNESCO. Futures literacy is a very interesting idea which goes to the heart of what you were just saying. Our relation to the future is instinctively a relation of colonization. And we don't always realize this. We want to colonize the future by predicting it or planning it. And of course, prediction and planning imply one another. At least prediction implies the possibility of planning, and planning requires prediction. And of course, the future is not plannable or predictable in that sense. To be literate about the future is to recognize that we have the wrong mindset, the wrong frameworks for thinking about the future. And once we drop prediction and planning, what we tend culturally to fall into is millenarianism. I was talking with, I think this was at dinner, not formally in the session, but if you go to the crazy parts of social media, which is most social media, you will see that there is a total eclipse of the sun on the 8th of April, visible in the Americas, and mostly in North America. It will be visible in Europe. The crazies are announcing that the 8th of April is the beginning of the apocalypse. Now, the fact that they're announcing it is of course interesting, but at least some people want to believe this, precisely because the future worries them, and what worries them about the future is indeterminacy. It's not that specific things will happen, it's that we don't know what will happen. And the best way of avoiding that terrible fear of openness is to close it down by a specific millenarian prediction, which is what happens when the Enlightenment idea of an indefinite, predictable future disappears. The only thing you have left is a definite date for the end times. Now, maybe I'm being naive here, maybe they're absolutely right. Maybe the world will end on the 8th of April, and it's very close, so we can check. Let's check notes on the 9th of April and see what, if anything, happened in the context of the eclipse. So futures literacy is the idea that we can have a more sophisticated relation to the future that involves first recognizing that the future doesn't exist. What we call the future is simply the present. It's our present imaginings of possibilities. Secondly, that because the future doesn't exist, we can't make it or plan it or predict it. On the other hand, what we do in the present will have consequences which unfold in the future. So when we're doing things in the present, let's be sensitive to the future possibilities we're opening up and closing up. And everything I said about possibilities, what would it be to have a museum of possibilities, is inspired by that framework, which again, I didn't develop intellectually, I just managed it, but I found it extremely interesting and instructive of futures literacy. So among other things, we need museums to be futures literate, which immediately implies a different relation to the past as well, for the reasons Luis mentioned, and which I alluded to also in my talk. The future and the past are separate things that require separate mindsets, separate tools, separate modes of organization. They're basically just two ways of saying the same thing.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
So before Ari, we will have 10 minutes, 15 minutes break to stretch the legs, drink some coffee, and then we